first purely commercial film theater opened in 1905, but the further spread of the cinemas reached its peak in the 1920s. At that time, about 800 films were produced in the USA, the highest frequency to date. At the same time that the commercialization of films was taking on a serious scale, more and more artists were discovering the medium for themselves. Surrealist Louis Buñuel, who used the medium in an experimental manner, described the moving image as a kind of poetic instrument with unlimited artistic possibilities. The preference that artists and investors saw in the medium was the same. The combination of moving image and sound appeals to the senses like no other medium, or like no other art form until then. Film is alive in a way.
La photographie, c'est la vérité. Et le cinéma, c'est 24 fois la vérité par seconde.
Proclaims the main character in Jean-Luc Godard's Le Petit Soldat. It can be understood that the film in its unique form is the most accessible of all media. However, the suggested truth of narrative film can also be understood differently. Media theorist, sociologist and philosopher Jean Baudrillard saw the film's pseudo-truth as a danger. A film that is so realistic that it would appear to be reality would be the death of cinema, and the beginning of a new era in which reality and cinematic fiction are completely interchangeable. On screen, whatever you choose to show becomes an undeniable reality in this context that does not submit to the rules of the real world. This has always led to the widespread allegation that cinema would arouse desires and longings, while the opposite is the case. The consumer goes to the cinema to see their own desires externalized in a fictional form.
Cinema is the ultimate pervert art. It doesn't give you what you desire. It tells you how to desire.
Explains philosopher and psychoanalyst Slavoj Žižek in his film The Pervert's Guide to Cinema. Later in the film, he explains this thesis using the example of pornography. Accordingly, the way in which desires are fulfilled in porn or other narrative films are so exaggerated that one can no longer take them seriously. To live out the fulfillment of desires fictionalized so exaggeratedly offers, in his opinion, a form of satisfaction that, if one were to live it out in real life, would become but horror. This inherent conflict between claiming truth and striving for a better fictional hyperreality is as old as film as a narrative medium. In the 1920s, the time after the First World War, the fascination for cinema consisted equally of enthusiasm for the technically new, lifelike moving images and of the distraction from the horrors of war. It is not without reason that many silent films of the time are characterized by silliness and exaggerated cheerfulness. The Jazz Singer was another technical innovation in 1927 that was to mark the end of the golden 20s in film history, the sound film.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you ain't heard nothing.
In the context of the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Second World War, a few more exemplary films were made in the 1930s showing how much the film industry continued to play with the longings anchored in the spirit of the times. In Possessed, a passing train accidentally awakens the longing for luxury and the extraordinary in the protagonist. As the train drives past, she looks through the windows into individual carriages, which she sees through a frame like moving still lifes. Slavoj Žižek compares this scene in The Pervert's Guide to Cinema with the viewer himself.
We get a very real, ordinary scene onto which the heroine's inner space, as it were, her fantasy space is projected. So that, although all reality is simply there, the train, the girl, part of reality in her perception and in our viewer's perception is, as it were, elevated to the magic level, becomes the screen of her dreams. This is cinematic art at its purest.
This allegory can be transferred to several other cinematic examples of the decade. The Wizard of Oz, in which fulfillment of desire is the core theme, was the most commercially successful film of the 1930s. Even if the first color film was made as early as 1902, The Wizard of Oz popularized, with the literal step into color film, a new cinematic medium that fascinated viewers and was later to become the industry standard. The possibility of color composition also became a new toy for contemporary filmmakers. In the 1940s, some of the most commercially successful films were cartoons, including Bambi, Pinocchio and Fantasia. The animated film suddenly became the main attraction in cinema, and not just for children. Another important technical innovation at that time was the television, which gained commercial relevance in the early 1950s. The television set represented an important technical development. For the first time, the medium of film had reached consumers' homes. The first program was broadcast in the USA in 1928, allegedly received by 4 devices. At the end of the 1940s, the offer in the USA had grown to 98 channels. In 1951, the first program was broadcast in color by CBS, which at the time only 12 devices received.
By pressing this button, which I now do, the cameras are transmitting a live color picture.
By the end of 1952, the number of TVs in private households had grown to just under 15 million. That year, the advertising industry in the US spent roughly $288 million on TV advertising, 38% more than the previous year. The commercial relevance of the TV was now undisputed at the latest. Television overtook the newspaper as the most used news source for the first time in 1963. In 1965, CBS called itself the Full Color Network and, according to its own information, broadcast 96% of the program in color. The vast majority of the most commercially successful films of the decade were color films, such as The Sound of Music, The Graduate and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. While in the late 60s the musical, as the formerly most popular genre, slowly lost commercial relevance and the Western experienced the last popular phase in the 1970s, the horror film became more and more popular. Jaws and The Exorcist were among the most successful films of the decade.